So we've been going over, there's a guy that I've become acquainted with. He's an atheist. He's a skeptic. He's actually kind of almost like an atheist evangelist. And he put out a video where there's 10 things that he's like, hey, I bet you wouldn't teach this in your church. I'm like, this is basic Bible school stuff. Of course we'd talk about it. So I'm going through the points that he thinks should cause trouble and anxiety and cause people to doubt. And so that's what we're looking at. We've been having some kind of technical troubles. There's a video, but the video won't play. My audio won't connect for some reason. But when I post this on the website, I will include the video, so you might want to go there and go watch it just to see what it is he is actually saying. So you actually see that I'm not misrepresenting him, that you get his argument straight from his mouth. I hadn't intended to show, but technical issues aren't allowing. So we talked about how apparently he claims, what were the first three? That, oh goodness, I can't remember now. What did we talk about last week? That the New Testament authors supposedly misquote the Old Testament, and we showed how there's nothing there that should cause any kind of angst over the truth of the Bible. Talked about there being no contemporary, there's no evidence from the 30 years while Jesus was, on the earth, that during the lifetime of Jesus, nothing was written about. It all came later, and how that's not a big deal. And how there are things that the Bible records that you would think would be like, wow, shouldn't other people have written these down? But we saw, well, maybe they would have, maybe they wouldn't have, and even if they had, we don't know those records would have even survived. And so that's not something that should cause angst. Now, what he is challenging, what he is asserting, is that the Gospels, he's going to say they do not present eyewitness. He phrases everything as a statement and then a question whether or not you would agree. And so the idea that the Gospels present eyewitness accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, do they present eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus? And he would strongly disagree, as we're going to look at in a minute, that he says, no, they're not eyewitnesses.
The Gospels present eyewitness accounts of the life and ministry of Jesus. Now, I realize that most of this I'm speaking to conservative evangelical Christians, and especially on this point here, a lot of Christians say, oh, no, these are not eyewitness accounts, but that doesn't change my belief in Jesus. But there's a lot of you out there listening who do believe this. And this guy here, I think, puts it well. Listen to, he's asked, why do you believe the Bible?
Said, I choose to believe the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies and claim that their writings are divine rather than human in origin.
Now, I know people who've memorized this. And so when guys like me ask, well, why do you believe the Bible's true? They will just...
Said, I choose to believe the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses.
Now, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is not true, what he said. At least according to historians. And this is what bothers me the most. This is probably why I do what I do here on YouTube, because I think guys like Vodi Bakum and others who say these things, they know what I'm about to say is true, and they don't tell their congregation this. They don't stand up on a Sunday morning and say, hey, I hold a minority position here. I believe that these were written by eyewitnesses, but most other scholars don't. And if you think I'm lying to you here, Oxford Annotated Bible is a well-respected book by many Christians, and it says, neither the evangelists nor their first readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm Christian faith. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus, so 30 at 40, post-70 AD. Thus, they do not represent eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. So now, when you hear a guy like Vodi say what he said, ask him, show him this quote, and say, do you agree with this quote? And if not, why do you disagree with the generally held consensus of scholarship? People who do this for a living. Bruce Metzger, Christian. In the case of the first gospel, Matthew, not the first gospel written chronologically, but the first one found in the Bible, Matthew, can scarcely be the final author. For why should one presumably have been an eyewitness of much that the records depend upon the account given by Marc, who had not been an eyewitness? Okay, what is Bruce Metzger saying here? He's saying here, look, wake up and listen. Why would a guy who walked with Jesus named Matthew borrow so heavily on the Gospel of Marc, who wasn't an eyewitness? It doesn't make sense. Just use your head. This is Bruce Metzger talking. The Gospel of John's authorship is doubted. This is Christian scholar Raymond Brown in the Introduction to New Testament, page 368 to 369. He explains, as with the other Gospels, it is doubted by most scholars that this gospel was written by an eyewitness of the public ministry of Jesus. Now, Christian scholar Raymond Brown might be wrong, right? That's what I think a lot of Christians are hoping or saying right now. But this is a scholar saying, no, this is doubted by most scholars. I want to play a clip by this guy, J. Warner Wallace. And I think this is very, very powerful. Now, remember, I just showed you a quote from the Oxford Annotated Bible that said that the Gospels were written 70, 80, and later. Listen to what J. Warner Wallace is going to say here.
If the Gospels were written late in history, over here somewhere, then you cannot trust them as eyewitness accounts. They weren't there. The eyewitnesses have been dead. By the way, if you want to lie about Jesus, let me tell you how you do it. You wait till everyone who knew Jesus is dead. Then you can say anything you want about Jesus. Who's going to know? If you want to lie about Jesus, let me tell you how you do it. You wait till everyone who knew Jesus is dead. Then you can say anything you want about Jesus. If you want to lie about Jesus, let me tell you how you do it. You wait till everyone who knew Jesus is dead.
Get the point? Now, scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written at a time when most people were dead. If you want to lie about Jesus, as J. Warner says, that's the time to write it. Estimated life expectancy in the ancient world, adapted from Fryer's Life Table of the Roman Empire. If you survive childbirth, for a 15-year-old to live to age about 20 is 93% chance. For a 15-year-old to live, now let's say you're about Jesus' age when Jesus walked the earth. That would Jesus died around 30 years old. So let's say you were 30 years old. The probability of you living to age 70, the first gospel written, is 10%. The Gospel of John is let's say it was written in 85. It's actually closer to 95. It's like 1 in 200 that anybody would be alive back then. Like, seriously, would you be alive today if there wasn't penicillin? They didn't have penicillin back then. Now, add to that the literacy rates. I shouldn't say add. Combine to that the literacy rates and just the sheer cost of writing back then. The probability, 10% of being alive, even at the first writing of Marc, and the probability that you even could write or hire a scribe and buy the paper and everything to write, take those percentages, it's like 10% times 10% is 1%. You're betting the truth value of just the eyewitnesses at 1%.
I would agree that they are eyewitnesses, not entirely. Luke and Marc were not, the disciples of Jesus. They were disciples of disciples. But their accounts are eyewitness accounts because they get them from eyewitnesses. So he picks on Vodi Bakum. Y'all know Vodi? know the name Vodi Bakum? He's a kind of out there public figure, preacher guy. And again, since I don't have, am I not working? Wait. There we go. That's Vodi Bakum. I don't have the audio, but he actually plays a clip of something that Vodi says, which I completely poached and plagiarized and used for a message one Sunday, I think about a couple years ago, about the Bible and how you can know the Bible is true. And like kind of why should you trust the Bible? And part of that is that it is an eyewitness account of the life of Christ. That it is historical documents written down by eyewitnesses, people who knew Jesus. And then this guy's going to say, no, that's not true. And now he tries to make his case. So we're going to look at a little bit of that. So he quotes the Oxford Annotated Bible. It's a very popular Bible. You'll find it in just about any school classroom that's teaching Bible. They're probably going to use that to some degree. And it pretty much reflects a lot of mainstream academic thought about the Bible. And here's what he quotes. It says, neither the evangelists, the authors of the Gospels, neither the evangelists nor their readers engaged in historical analysis. Their aim was to confirm Christian faith. Scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. They thus do not present eyewitness or contemporary accounts of Jesus' life and teachings. And so that's from the Oxford Annotated Bible. That's a pretty common idea that a lot of scholars will put forth. Now, a lot of times they'll try to make it sound like all scholars, this is just what it is, this is how it's accepted. No, it's actually not. There's quite a few who hold to different ideas. Plus, even if it is true, and I think it is, that a lot of scholars believe this, truth is not a popularity contest. Right? Determining what is actually the case is not a popularity contest. So just looking at what it is that he says that the evangelists and their readers were not engaged in historical analysis. Their aim, the reason they were writing, was to confirm the Christian faith. And what was that very, very important question that we talked about last week that you should always ask someone who drops a statement like that? Yes, and what? What am I supposed to get from this? Okay, so they weren't historians. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not historians trying to create a historical, record. They were people writing an account to show, hey, these things happened, you can trust them. Okay, it doesn't mean that it's true or not true. Right? That there's nothing about them not being historians that says, well, don't believe this, it's not true. Right? It says that scholars generally agree that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years after the life of Jesus, or the death of Jesus. And therefore, they do not present eyewitness accounts. He actually says, hey, person listening to this, Christian listening to this, why don't you ask your pastor why they do not agree with majority of accepted scholarship. And so let me tell you why I don't agree with the majority of accepted scholarship. First off, there's no such thing as a consensus in academia. You'll hear this all the time. Well, a consensus of scholars, a consensus of scientists. That's not how academia works. That's not how scholarship works. Minority views can still, make their case and stand their ground and rise or fall. Doesn't matter all that much. And so while it may be true that there is a plurality, right, a large number, or even a majority of scholars who think this, by no means means that it's actually true. That therefore you must accept it. If you ever study logic, there's things called fallacies. This is an error in thinking. And two errors being committed here is one, the appeal to authority. Well, because they said so. The authority said so, so therefore it's true. Well, authorities can say stuff that's wrong, right? think, we're in election season. I think we all know that authority figures can say things that aren't true. It's also what's called the bandwagon fallacy. Well, it's what everyone else believes. Most people think this, so I'm going to believe it too. Well, those are errors in thinking. They're called logical fallacies. I reject the conclusions of a lot of this scholarship because the basis on which they are formed is an error. It's ideological. It's not evidence-based. Let me show you why. They say that the Gospels were written 40 to 60 years. Do you know why they would say 40 years after the life of Christ? Because Jesus died in about 30, 33, somewhere in there, AD. So early 30s. And so they're saying that the Gospels were written 40 years after that. The main reason why they date that is because something happened in 70 AD, 40 years later, that Jesus predicted. Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And then it happened. Well, now, a secular scholar, someone who's not religious, someone who doesn't think it's likely, is going to say, okay, prophecies don't really happen, so obviously they would have written this after the destruction of the temple. They couldn't have written it before because prophecies aren't true. That's a lot of the ideological drive of what's pushing this is they'll say the miracle claims, the prophetic claims, no, we don't take those seriously. And so they assume that they had to have been written afterwards. Why assume that? That's an ideological idea. That's a belief. They have their belief and they're bringing it into their scholarship whenever, hey, you know what? If supernatural is real, if miracles do happen, if Jesus is who he says he is and he prophesied, well, then it could have been true. So, no reason to throw that out. Secularism, skepticism, these are the kind of basic belief views of a lot of Bible scholars. A lot of leading Bible scholars, they're not Christian, they're at secular state schools, and so they have to approach things from a secular point of view. It's their mindset, it's their methodology, to where they assume that the better explanation is automatically going to be the one that's not miraculous. So the miraculous is, in their thinking, automatically the least possible, the least to be considered idea. Of course, that, again, is ideological, not evidence-based. And they'll say, okay, so these supernatural things that are in there, they had to have been added later. Right? They say Jesus really did exist. There really was a man. There was a teacher named Jesus. He was crucified. But people didn't really think he was God. He didn't really do all these miracles. So therefore, all this stuff was added later. Well, you can't add that stuff and make it up unless you're writing later. Because if you were there and you know a miracle didn't happen, well, then I can't make one up. I have to wait until later to make one up. Right? You can't tell a lie while everyone around already knows the truth. You have to wait till they're all gone. And so they think, okay, well, all these legendary, all this mystical, miraculous stuff, well, that had to have been added later after all the eyewitnesses were gone and couldn't argue against it. And so therefore, again, they say, therefore the Gospels had to be written generation or two later. But that's all ideological assumption. That's not actual evidence about the text. Any thoughts or questions regarding that? Make sense? Clear as mud? All right. Then he goes on and he quotes this guy, Bruce Metzger. He's a Christian. He's actually a fairly well-respected scholar among a lot of Christian groups. He is no longer with us. He's gone on to be with the Lord. But there's a lot of this scholarship that he also kind of was convinced by and bought into. And this is what he says. It says, in the case of the first gospel, the Apostle Matthew can scarcely be the final author, for why would one who presumably had been an eyewitness of much of the records depend upon the account that's given by Marc, who had not been an eyewitness? So, just to break that down, the scholarly idea, the popular notion, is that Matthew who the author of Matthew is, the disciple of Jesus by that name. Mark was a disciple of Peter. Now, a lot of scholars say that, well, if you look at Matthew and Mark, it looks like to them that Matthew copied Mark. And so his argument is, wait a minute, if Matthew was really the one writing it, why is he copying someone who wasn't even there? Right? Matthew's the one who was there. Wouldn't you want to copy Matthew? Why would Matthew be copying Mark? Mark wasn't even there. And so, that kind of sounds a little reasonable, except, I don't know, there's all kinds of different ways this could be approached. First off, I personally don't think that Mark came first. That's a fairly popular idea among scholars nowadays, but do you know why your Bible has Matthew, Mark, Luke, John in that order? Because that's the order that traditionally accepted by the church they had been written. So they were put in the Bible in the order that they had been written. This was largely uncontested. No one argued about it. No one debated it until maybe a couple hundred years ago or so. And so I think that the people back then knew a whole lot more than we do now about what was written by whom and when. And so I think Matthew was written first. In which case, it's kind of hard for Matthew to copy a book that hadn't been written yet, because Mark hadn't written yet. So, and this reasoning can also be turned around. Right? If we're going to stop and say, why would Matthew be copying Mark whenever Matthew was supposed to be an eyewitness? Well, okay. So Matthew's the eyewitness. Why would he copy Mark? Oh, he wouldn't. He didn't. You can argue that way just as easily. It's just kind of whichever one sounds better to you. But that's not how truth is decided. So, all right. So it kind of fits either way. We can just back and forth and argue, and it's just whatever idea you want to believe. Well, but that doesn't actually settle the question. But even if Mark came first, let's say they're correct on that. Can you think of any reasons why Matthew would want to use Mark's gospel as a resource? Even though he was there personally, why might he use Mark's? Where did Mark get his information from? Anyone know? You remember? Peter. He was a disciple of Peter. And so Mark was writing what he heard from Peter. Well, so if you're Matthew, there's all kinds of different ways, and this is all be speculation, but if you're Matthew, maybe there were things that you weren't actually there at that time. I know you were on the food run or whatever. So you weren't there, so hey, you'll use Peter's. Or maybe Matthew is like I am, and just does not have a head for details. Right, you can just go through an event and you're just like, well, Alan was there. That's about all I remember. Right? But where do you get the details from? Well, hey, this other person was there and he remembers everything. So I'm going to use his account. Right? And so he might use Mark's because Mark got his from Peter and Peter remembered better. There's all kinds of different ways that you could come up with why this might be the case. Ultimately, these sorts of why would they do this? Why would this be the case kind of speculation? It doesn't actually accomplish anything. It doesn't really get you to any kind of real answers. It's some nice thoughts, maybe just kind of sit around and go, I wonder. But it's not something you should base your final conclusions on. It might be a neat musing, but rather than guessing at these unanswerable questions, how about you actually just look at the evidence? And so then he's going to go on. My thing ain't working there. So any thoughts, questions about that? I might move pretty fast, so feel free to wave me down. Okay. He quotes. I don't know that you can see that. He quotes this guy. What's his name? Brown. I think his full name. Raymond Brown. Now, Raymond Brown, Bible scholar. He was a Catholic scholar. He says, as with the other Gospels, it is doubted by most scholars that this Gospel was written by an eyewitness of the public ministry of Jesus. So he's saying the Gospel of John, like the others, so he says, was not written by an eyewitness. Okay, well, first off, Dr. Brown is a very controversial scholar. I don't think that we could say he represents the mainstream of Christian thought. A lot of his fellow scholars, especially in the Catholic Church, did not like him. There was quite a bit of argument about his ideas and the things he published and said. So I don't know that I would go to him as an authoritative source. Now, I'll grant it is true that many, maybe even most, scholars would say, hey, the Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. But again, truth is not a popularity contest. Right? It's what does the case actually say? What does the evidence actually support? Okay, and there are reasons to think that they are wrong. And not to, this isn't like a slam dunk argument against, but a lot of what I see from scholars and ideas and things about is almost like chronological snobbery. We know better. We can see clearly. Those people back then, well, they were, they didn't know. They were biased, they were simple, they were illiterate, whatever the accusation is. We are the scholars, we are the ones who, and so you almost kind of get this kind of snobbery going on. I don't know that that's necessarily always the case, but I think it's definitely an attitude I've heard reflected. And so I wouldn't hold up anything Dr. Brown says as being the end-all, be-all to solve the case. Now, I really wish I had the audio for this because he plays a clip from J. Warner Wallace. We did a study with J. Warner Wallace. He's a cold case homicide detective. He is high profile. He's been on Dateline several times. If I remember a story right, his wife became a Christian and he was thinking, oh no, my wife's gone crazy. I got to figure out what this thing is. And so he dug in and he used his detective skills and applied it to solving the 2,000-year-old cold case of Jesus' resurrection. And he ended up becoming a Christian because of the evidence that he saw as a skeptical detective applying his craft. The one thing he says, if you lie, or if you want to lie about Jesus, wait until everyone who knew Jesus is dead. Then you make up anything you want. No one can tell you you're wrong because nobody was there. And so what's interesting is he plays this clip and he's like, aha, see, all this stuff was made up because these people wrote late. It's taken out of context. I've actually seen this talk. I've seen this video that it comes from. And the context of the overall point that he is making is that the Bible actually was written early and was written by eyewitnesses. That's his whole case. Are you going to come teach? All right. So it's kind of weird. This is one of those things where he just like cherry picks a statement somebody makes and just pulls it out of context and then tries to make the exact opposite point with it. So I don't really know what he was doing or trying to accomplish there, but it didn't work. All right. Then there's this idea that they wouldn't have lived that long. People back then, the average lifespan was about 30, 35 years. Right? And so he has this chart that's this breakdown of what the chances are that someone is going to live long enough that if the disciples at the time of Jesus, if they were to live 40 years, remember he's claiming that it was 40 years later that things got written. And so he says, if the disciples were 30, let's say they're the same age as Jesus. So they're 30 years old and they don't write until 40 years later. That puts them at 70. And so you break this down, and it's a 10% chance that they would survive to be that old, to be able to write. So he's saying there's only a 10% chance that these disciples could have written the Gospels. And whenever you go to John, because John was written, he would have been like 85, 90, so that gets down to like less than 1% chance. Well, the problem is the dates are all completely wrong. He's assuming the late dates, which I think are bad assumptions. But if you figure the early dates, we've talked before about the dating of the Gospels, okay? That the book of Acts would have been written in the early 60s AD. Luke is kind of the prequel to Acts, so that would have been back up a little bit, maybe at the late 50s. And most people agree that Matthew and Mark were written before Luke. Okay, so now we're backed up almost all the way to about 50, maybe even earlier. So we're looking at let's just round up to be nice, 20 years after the death of Jesus. And chances are, the disciples were not the same age as Jesus. They were probably younger. Back then, by the time you're 15, 16, you're an adult. You're working. You're not, living off your parents. You're expecting to be striking out on your own. I mean, you're a young adult, but you're an adult. And so chances are, let's just to be nice, let's say they were 20. Okay, well, 20 plus 20, so they would have been 40 years old. Actually, the chance of that is about, where did I write that down? Is about 61%. So 61% chance they'd still be alive to write their Gospels. That's pretty good odds. A lot better than what he was saying using his false numbers. So, all right. Again, I'm flying through. Any questions? Thoughts, comments? Kind of making sense? Then he throws out this. Well, people back then weren't literate. Most people could not read. I don't know where he gets these figures. I mean, he cites it, but I don't know this person, I don't know this work, I don't know if they're true or accurate, but let's assume they are. And he says 20% of people would have been partially literate. They probably could have read a little bit, but not really. Only about 10% of people were fully literate and able to read and write. So what he is saying is, if you have 10% chance, oh no, are we okay? Oh. I want to make sure he's okay. Okay? Yeah. So, his math says that 10%, that they might have survived, plus 10% that they could have been able to be literate to write. You do the math on that probability, that comes out to 1% chance that the disciples could have actually written. But we've already said his math is all wrong. It wouldn't have been 10%. Plus, he says the cost of a book, right? The price of paper would have just been prohibitive, and there's no way that these poor fishermen and shepherds, or who could have afforded the paper to write the books. I'm hoping that you can just pause and see the problem there. You don't actually yourself have to be literate in order to compose something. They had people called scribes that you would pay them, and you would dictate, and they would write it down for you. Okay? So they could have very easily done that. Even if the disciples themselves could not read and write, they could hire someone who could. Oh, but the money! Look at how just prohibitive this cost is. It's $30 for a page. Average costs anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000 or more for an entire book. There is no way these guys could have afforded that. Except that the apostles what were they doing in the years after Jesus' life? They were planting churches. And what do churches tend to do? Pass an offering plate. Right? If it was like, hey, the apostle wants to write down the story of Jesus, you think the church might have come up with the funds to pay for some paper so they could write it down? Nothing here is any kind of prohibitive situation. And so there's nothing there to show us that, or make us think that they would not have written it. And so, as we can see, every step of the way, everything he puts out there is like that does not add up to the disciples not being eyewitnesses. Okay? There's one comment that he makes, and he says many Christians would say, because whenever he asked the question about eyewitness accounts, he says many Christians would say, no, these are not eyewitnesses, but that doesn't change my belief in Jesus. And there are a lot of Christians who would say, not eyewitnesses, but that's okay, I still believe. Now, you don't get the voice inflection with me reading it, and just knowing my experience with Doug, it just seems to be that he's probably thinking that this is people just choosing to believe. They're just having faith because it feels good and they want it to be true. Well, actually, it's because whether or not the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses wouldn't actually affect greatly. I mean, it might affect a little bit, but it's not going to be a great impact on whether or not they're reliable accounts. You realize that most of history is recorded by second and third hand accounts after the event. And so if that were the case with the Gospels, well, okay, but they'd just be in the same boat as most historical documents that historians and skeptics have no problem accepting as reliable. But with the Gospels, they want to make something different. And so the only account that we have, when you really get right down to it, they have all this speculation, they have all these ideas and these little arguments he makes. The only accounts that we have for the authors of the Gospels say that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them. If you remember about a year ago or so, we did a study, little posters back there in the corner, that was titled, Who Wrote the Gospels? And we went through the evidence from the early church, from the very earliest writings that we have from the church, and saw that from the beginning, only Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are attributed with being the authors of those Gospels. There are no alternative ideas. There is no evidence pointing to something else. And so, while skeptics might have all these kind of ideological things that cause them problems, really all the evidence, like all of it, is on the side of the Gospels. That talk, Who Wrote the Gospels, it's on the website. You can go find it. I stole that one from Tim McGrew, who he literally has hours and hours and hours worth of lectures and presentations on this topic. So, whereas this guy tries to discredit it in about a 7-minute quick video that doesn't do its job, when you actually dig into the historical evidence, there are hours and hours and hours. I mean, people take classes on this and just study. So there's tons of evidence and information out there. So, thoughts, questions? All right. Again, we see ideas being put forward that whenever you kind of actually pick them apart a little bit, you see they don't stand.
Not only ideas, but petty. It's petty.
Yeah. And really, it kind of is. I mean, you stop and think, oh, well, look, they were illiterate and couldn't afford the paper. Well, there are ways around that. There's no reason to assume it.
Let's just give up.
Yeah. And so, all right, I think we have enough time to squeeze in this one. Luke. Okay, the statement, Luke was a companion of Paul who carefully recorded some of the history of Jesus. Would you agree with that? Is that kind of what you've been taught? Is that your understanding that Luke was, he's a physician and he was a companion of Paul?
Now, I hear a lot of pastors and apologists just really praise the author of Luke, who we, by the way, don't know was Luke. Luke was a companion of Paul who carefully recorded some of the history of Jesus. I think on this one, a lot of Christians would say strongly agree. But what do professionals say about Luke, the Gospel of Luke? First of all, a lot of people say that Luke was great because he interviewed eyewitnesses. I actually hear Christians say that. But if you look at Luke chapter 1, it doesn't say that he interviewed any eyewitnesses, that he drew up an account as they were handed down to us. So the authors basically say, and this could be actually just oral traditions, it could be other texts, we don't know. But nowhere here does it say he actually interviewed anybody who saw Jesus with their own eyes. Another quote from Oxford Annotated Bible. However, the Ox points out that the author was probably, this is the author of Luke, probably someone from the Pauline mission area who a generation or so after Paul addressed issues facing Christians who found themselves in circumstances different from those addressed by Paul himself. Hence, we once more have an anonymous author who was distanced from the various traditions and stories that he later compiled as a non-eyewitness. Now, some people say that the we passages in the book of Acts show that, oh no, these are eyewitnesses because it says we, we did this, we did that. This is William Campbell in the we passages in the Acts of the Apostles. I'll start in the middle here. More important, the fact that Acts provides no information, and indeed, by writing anonymously and constructing an anonymous observer, actually withholds information about a putative historical eyewitness, suggests that the first person plural in Acts has to do with the narrative, not with historical eyewitnessing. This is Randall Helms in Who Wrote the Gospels, page 2. Now, it says in Acts 12:12 that whoever wrote the book of Acts talks about Mark, apparently, supposedly, the Mark who wrote the Gospel of Mark. But he doesn't put the dots together. So let's read the quote. So the author of Luke Acts not only knew about John Mark of Jerusalem, the personal associate of Peter and Paul, but also possessed a copy of what we call the Gospel of Mark, copying some 300 of its verses into the Gospel of Luke, and never once thought to link the two, John Mark and the Gospel of Mark, together. Like he could have said, oh, by the way, this John Mark in Acts 12:12, this is the one who I got a lot of my information from when I wrote the Gospel of Luke. The reason is simple. The connecting of the anonymous Gospel of Mark with John Mark of Jerusalem is a 2nd century guess on that had not been made in Luke's time. So we have like a pattern of, within all the Gospels, of them being anonymous. They don't cite their sources. They don't say when they wrote it, where they wrote it. Now, I've heard the rebuttal, well, you shouldn't expect that for that time, that in history. Like in the 1st century, people didn't write like that. Well, that's not true. Here's Dionysius writing, stating specific names of where he got his information from, when he wrote it. He even critiques some of his sources and so forth.
And he quotes Luke here in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, where Luke, lays out his introduction. Excuse me. He points out that nowhere in here does it say that Luke interviewed eyewitnesses. It says, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us. And kind of the way he approaches that idea of being handed down was it was like passed down, several steps removed. Well, it could have just very easily been handed down from the apostles themselves. It doesn't say who it was handed down from. Kind of the assumption that it's generations later is, again, it's an assumption. Speculation is being built in. So he says, nowhere does it say that Luke interviewed eyewitnesses. Well, okay. So he didn't interview eyewitnesses, but he had other accounts and other records. Also, nowhere does it say that he didn't. It says the information was handed down to him. Well, maybe that was handed down from an apostle or eyewitnesses themselves. You don't have to assume that it means he did not speak with the eyewitnesses. And if he actually is a traveling companion of Paul, which the evidence claims he is, if he actually is a traveling companion of Paul, then he would have had access to other witnesses. Right? In his travels, he probably would have come across maybe even some of the 12 disciples as well and gotten to talk to them. But surely he may have also come in contact with other people who had seen Jesus. So he got to talk to witnesses. Again, he quotes from the Oxford Annotated Bible. And we get to see this wonderful popular scholarship. It says, the Oxford Annotated Bible points out that the author was probably someone from the Pauline mission and who a generation or so after Paul addressed issues facing Christians who found themselves in circumstances different from those addressed by Paul himself. Hence, we once more have an anonymous author who was distanced from the various traditions and stories he later compiled as a non-eyewitness. Here's the thing. Now, granted, he's quoting from one little paragraph from a book, but why think that's true? It gives nothing of any kind of support or reason to think it. It's just being asserted. There was a popular atheist who died several years ago, Christopher Hitchens, and he had what people called Hitchens' razor. It was a little saying that he would throw out there. you'd use it to taunt Christians, but I think it's a great little saying. It says, anything that is asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. If someone just makes a claim and they don't give you anything to back it up, okay, just, who cares? You know, I don't have to believe your claim just because you said it. You got to give me something. There's nothing offered here. Maybe there is other stuff he could point to, but it's not pointed to here. So again, that doesn't give us anything from which we would draw any conclusions. The we passages. I don't know if you're aware, but in the book of Acts, there's a point where it switches to first person, where the author is saying, we went here and we did that and we traveled and we boarded a ship, and those kind of things. And a lot of scholars say, well, that is kind of where Luke joined with Paul. He was a traveling companion of Paul, and these are things that he was there for, and so he's recording eyewitness accounts. And then some people say, no, that's not the case. In here, excuse me, it's kind of a long, rambling thing. Point is, says that questions regarding the we sections are unanswerable on the basis of the evidence. The problem is, we don't have any evidence. The only evidence that we have about who the author of Acts was says that it was Luke, who was a traveling companion of Paul. We have writings from Tertullian of Carthage, from Irenaeus of Lyons, and from the Muratorian fragment, all of which I think are from about the 2nd century. But the only accounts that we have that point at and say he wrote it, he was there, they say Paul wrote it, and Paul was a traveling companion. I mean, Luke wrote it, and Luke was a traveling companion of Paul. I think that we don't have any alternative evidence. We have speculation based on assumptions. Whereas what we have from the early church says Luke wrote it, Luke was a companion of Paul. This one I really like. He quotes this guy. Randall Helms, he wrote a book called Who Wrote the Gospels? And he says that the author of Luke or Acts not only knew about John Mark, so he's pointing out this idea. Let me just summarize it real quick. In Acts, he refers to someone who is John, also known as Mark. And a lot of people think that that is the author of Mark. That John Mark was a guy in Jerusalem who would have kind of been associated with the disciples. He eventually became Peter's disciple. But at one point, Luke refers to him in Acts. And people say, well, if he's referring to him in the book of Acts, surely he would have known that this is the guy who wrote the book of Mark, which Luke uses as a source. But he doesn't mention anything about it. And so they're pointing at this as some kind of example that Luke didn't actually know these people, that it's a later writing. The issue here is we don't actually know that John Mark is the guy who wrote the book of Mark. I think he probably was. Some scholars do. A lot of scholars do. But nothing hinges on that. That doesn't actually affect anything one way or the other if he is or if he isn't. So if the John Mark that Luke writes about is not the author of the gospel, so what? It doesn't do anything. It doesn't actually lead you to anything. But here's an interesting thing about this particular scholar. And this doesn't mean, I mean, this would be an ad hominem if this was just my argument, but you kind of have to stop and think about the source a little bit. In this book he writes, or I don't know if it was this one or another one, he actually mentions that he thinks that the book of Luke was written by a woman, because he says the author is very sympathetic to women and very unflattering to men. So therefore it is written by a woman. That's pure speculation, made up. Right? There is nothing anywhere in any historical tradition, in any accounts that says Luke was anything other than Luke, a man, the physician, companion of Paul. And so if this is kind of the methodology of scholarship that's trying to get used I have no problem just saying, sorry, bye, try again when you have something real to offer. Then he mentions that there seems to be this pattern in the Gospels. They're anonymous, meaning no one signed their name. So it's like all the copies that we have of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the earliest copies don't have a name on them, right? They didn't sign it, Like whenever Paul writes a letter, he's writing a letter, so he actually identifies himself. I, Paul, a bondservant of Christ, And so he lets you know who it's from because it's a letter. But the Gospels, they didn't sign their names. But all the evidence, all the accounts, all the records, everything anyone ever says in the early church attributes it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But this idea is that the Gospels, they're anonymous, they don't cite their sources, they don't actually say when they were writing or where they were writing. And the common comeback to that, and it's one that I would use and I have used and I'll continue to use, is that generally speaking, that is not how it was done back then. By and large, that's not how historians wrote. And again, he's already pointed out earlier in his video that they weren't writing history. They weren't historians. He actually tried to use that against that as a reason to think that they're not reliable. Well, okay, you've already admitted they're not historians trying to write strict history, so they don't cite their sources, so they don't name who or where they're writing and when. They're not historians. We've already admitted to that. Okay, so that shouldn't surprise anybody. But he gives this example. I'm not going to bother trying to read it. It's from a historian called Dionysius, who he actually does go into some detail about who he studied with, where he studied, where he was when he wrote, the sources he used, right? So he actually goes into a lot of detail about this kind of stuff. But we have no reason to think that this is representative of the way all historians and writers back then were doing things. He could be the exception, not the rule. And indeed, as far as my understanding is of ancient history practices, he would be the exception. Some historians were very careful and precise and specific. Other historians weren't. And by and large, we cannot take our 21st century idea of how these things should be done and push them back on a 2,000-year-old document. There's not really any issue here. I mean, now some of this is kind of interesting to make you go, okay, I'd like to look at that more. But nothing that is offered in any of this presentation, in this video, which I would encourage you, it'll be posted, you can go watch, that none of it rises to a point that you should have any kind of anxiety or doubt over the claims of the Bible, whether or not the scriptures are true, whether or not they're eyewitnesses, or whether or not Luke was a companion of Paul. That nothing he has presented should give anyone any kind of pause or anxiety or doubt over these things. Because the actual evidence we have, the actual writings that we have from early church fathers pointing to the Gospels, hold to the idea that they were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think all the evidence points to an early writing. Once you kind of get rid of the whole secularist, skeptic mindset that says prophecy and miracles, aren't real. If you're not imposing that, if you're not kind of bringing that into the process, everything lines up kind of nice that the Bible is written early by eyewitnesses. So, thoughts, questions, comments?
I would think that they would be writing this stuff down as they went.
Think they'd be writing it down as they went?
I do.
I'm sure they probably were. And one thing I've always thought was funny is whenever people say, well, they wrote decades later. How well do you remember something you did 10, 20, 30 years ago? Well, not very, but if you're talking about it and teaching it over and over and over and over again for 20 or 30 years, I think you're going to remember it. So even if they didn't actually write it down, because it wasn't oral culture. That's something we kind of lose sight of. Remember we had a Q&A and Patrick talked about it a little bit. They were an oral culture. They memorized things because most of them were illiterate. And so they actually had to learn, and they would remember things to a point that I think we would just be astonished. Because that's just how their lives went. Right? And so they may have been writing down some, they may have been taking notes and passing things around. And, I'm sure whenever the apostles would get together, they'd sit around and talk about, you remember that time that Jesus did whatever? And they'd sit and talk about it. And so it's just always being rehashed. It's what they're teaching, it's what they're talking about. They're going to retain this information, so even if they wrote it down later, it's still like fresh and forefront in their minds, plus the Holy Spirit was helping them out too.